In the realm of thought, the religious Israelite or Jew was marked off from the more civilized Gentiles, such as the Greeks, literally Hellenes, by the fact that he was essentially a seer rather than a reasoner. As the custodian of the law and the revelation, it was not his place or his right to reason about these. He did not need to search for wisdom or science, as the Greeks did, because he possessed as a national treasure a revelation which told him all he required to know in this life. The Hebrew seers were not philosophers, as Paul told the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 1:22. The Jews were asking for signs, and Hellenes or Greeks were seeking wisdom, Sophia. Well did the Hebrews know that some of their forefathers had seen and even talked with God. Was not one brief glimpse of Jehovah worth far more than all the science or wisdom of the nations? If we have to identify Israel, let us not seek him in a nation which runs after so-called science, and let us seek him as scattered among all nations, Luke 21-24. Peter in Acts 4:27 enumerates 4 human agents or factors as conspiring to bring about the death of Messiah: Herod, Pilate, together with Gentiles and peoples of Israel. These last cannot be other than Israelites. About the year 1873, a book was published in London by Edward Hine called The British Nation Identified with Lost Israel. On the final page, 296, this amazing statement is made. One of the most beautiful results of this theory is that the royal race of David is emancipated from the sins of crucifying the Messiah. They were in Ireland and were not consenting to the act of the remaining race of Judah. Surely Paul's long, sorrowful lament for his people, Israel, found in the 9th chapter of Romans and down to the end of the 11th chapter of Romans, cannot mean that they were innocent of the crime of murdering their Messiah. If in the first century these Israelites were in what is now known as Ireland or in Britain, why should Paul's great sorrow for them be unceasable and painful? Why should he quote Isaiah as crying over Israel that a remnant only would be saved? Romans 9:27. Why again does he quote from Isaiah, who was very daring in declaring that God was found by those who not seeking him, while towards Israel God says, "The whole day do I spread out my hands towards an unyielding and gainsaying people." Isaiah 10:20-21. Why does he write that only the chosen ones encountered what they were seeking, while the rest of Israel were made callous? 11:7. Is it not by the lapse of Israel that the salvation comes to the Gentiles, so that Israel may be provoked to jealousy? It is the casting away of the same Israel that is world conciliation. The disciples ought to have known better than ask the question found in Acts 1:6. But had they asked the Lord whether he was about to restore the kingdom to a people dwelling 2,000 or 2,500 miles to the west of Palestine in the British Isles, we feel sure that the Lord would have doubted their sanity. This again raises another historical point. Are we to go back to the original and primitive people who settled in Britain? And if so, who were they? The date of the erection of the huge monoliths which make up Stonehenge in Wiltshire is calculated as being about 1500 BC by means of astronomical measurements. If the people who erected such huge structures about such a time were indeed Israelites, why did they build what are obviously pagan temples of the sun throughout all Britain? And how did these Israelites make their exodus from Egypt about the same time, settle in their own God-given land after 40 years of wanderings in the wilderness, then cross Europe in another exodus as a nation, or travel by sea to Britain and become settled there by about 1500 BC? Moreover, if such temples were really shrines for the worship of Jehovah, it ought to to be demonstrated that similar temples of the same age or earlier existed in the Holy Land. How comes it also that the descendants of this same people have completely abandoned these temples and do not know assuredly for what purpose they were erected? And how did it happen that these Hebrews completely lost every trace of their pure Hebrew speech, so that in the days of Paul they spoke a tongue akin to the language of the opposite coast of Gaul? Why, in many parts of Britain to this day, counting out rhymes are still used for counting sheep, in which preserve the primitive numerals of the ancient Britons? These numerals are not a bit like ancient Hebrew, but some of them come close to modern Welsh, as pimp for 5, pethera for 4, and dik or dek for 10. These come very close to Greek. These ancient words for 5 are especially interesting, being so different from Hebrew shemesh. When a Greek counted by means of his fingers, the whole hand signified all, or pan, from which the numeral pente or pimpe and the name Pompey, a 5th child or son. A further complication arises if we have to reckon as Israelites not only the ancient Britons but the nation of the Angles, who, owing to Slavonic pressure, cleared out of the northern part of the old kingdom of Hanover, along with many of the Friarsons in the 5th century or earlier, and came to Scotland in the country which they named England. It is claimed that these were another part of the nation of Israel. It is often stated they were pagans. No one can prove that they were all pagans. A great many people in Britain today are just as much pagan. For all we know, Walfilla's translation of the Greek scriptures into the Gothic language in the middle of the 4th century may have made a profound impression upon the Angles, who spoke a tongue very close to Gothic. Were the ancient Britons and the Angles one and the same people by race, that is, all Israelites? If so, if two branches of Israel now, after perhaps almost 2,000 years, celebrating their reunion, why did wars continue between them for a few hundred years? The Venerable Bede, or Bede, B-E-D-E, died around 735 A.D., wrote that in his day the scriptures were read in all the languages of Britain, 5 in number: Latin, Anglo, British, Scottish or Gaelic, and Pietish. Language is no true test of race, yet it seems odd that the two branches of Israel should talk languages so very different as ancient British and Anglo, while the people universally known as the Jews have retained some knowledge of the Hebrew language wherever they have wandered. As for the physical differences between the Israelites of Britain and those always known as Jews all over the world, Edward Hine set forth the extraordinary theory that these Jews, whom he called Judah, or the two tribes, have been under the curse since the crucifixion, while the Israelites had not. And as part of the awful curse, the Jews' features had been altered. The change has been entirely with the Jews. Before the crucifixion, presumably, the features of the Jews were similar to those now found in Britain. Hine was a most clever and cunning writer, but very unscrupulous. It is so easy to hold to proved statements which no one could easily disprove. Thousands of simple souls were carelessly deceived by his specious arguments, and in our day thousands are still being deceived by the same flimsy reasonings. No wonder the Reverend David Barron of London stated in his final book, The History of the 10 Lost Tribes, 1915, that the theory we are criticizing was enough to provoke God's judgment against a nation, Britain. Let us not imagine God is pleased with any such teaching which makes his word so largely of none effect. The general physical characteristics of a nation change very little in the course of time, only imperceptibly. Ethnologists have found that one of the most permanent features is the measurement of the skull. It is significant that the races with broader heads tends toward Catholicism and subjection to despots, while those with narrower heads and a pronounced occupant prefer independence and democracy. In Britain, the great bulk of the people are long-headed, dolichocephalic, or nearly so, which important fact has greatly helped to make the various ingredients of the population homogeneous. The Jews are generally reckoned as melanocroa, that is, white people with dark hair. But there is a fair proportion of blondes and also of red-haired or red-bearded people. There are two types of skull. One is the Semitic type, very like the Arabian, a long head, narrow in the forehead, while the other is the Semitic type, only somewhat broader than the formal type. The broader type comprises roughly the Ashkenazim Jews, German, Russian, Polish, while the narrower type is found in the Sephardim Jews, Spanish, Italian, Balkans, African. Strange it seems that no one appears to have sought Judah in the small Sephardic portion, and Israel in the much larger Ashkenaz portion. That would be a much better theory than making a race so different from the Jews as the British, their brethren. The ridiculous theory that two-tribe Judah alone was punished because of the crucifixion loses its force when we consider that for ancient Britons or Israelites, at the same time as the crucifixion and for 400 years afterwards were under the heel of the very Roman power which scattered the Jews all over the world. Indeed, it looks as though these Israelite Britons must have been equally guilty, those at least who dwelt in their land, which later came to be called England. However, they made up for this to some extent in the year 1290 when King Edward I of England expelled all Jews for debasing and clipping the coinage, for taking extortionate usury, and for not being Christians. They were not permitted back to England until the year 1650. Yet now, after another 300 years, they remain in all Britain as a people apart, while the British nation certainly does not look upon them as a brother nation. Nor do the British, if really Israelites, look at the new state of Israel in the Holy Land with the slightest jealousy. Indeed, for 30 years they have helped to establish it.